when the response time is very less, then you can say that that kind of system or a software is more efficient. So that in the terms of quick in response also we can accept a software. If it is a prototyping, then there will be a involvement of the customer or a stakeholders when the development of system or a process or a product is being done. If they are able to do the project, but if it is not worth for their organization or an enterprise, then they won't accept. Hello everybody, a warm welcome to one and all. Welcome back to the session 6 of Unit 2, and we are in the B.C.A 6th semester subject called Software Engineering. I am Rohini T.S. Department of Computer Science, Vidhyaashram First Grade College, the Temple of Excellence, MYSURU. So before getting into our today's session, just we'll have a quick recap of my previous sessions. So as we all know that in the 5th session of this chapter, we had a discussion regarding problem analysis, like why we need to do the analysis of a problem, and also I have discussed regarding what are the stages of problem solving we have. Along with that, I have discussed regarding the software metrics and measures along with its classification or types, and also we got to know regarding the monitoring and controlling of the software requirements and how it needs to be monitored and controlled in each stage. That is what I have discussed along with the process what we have in the monitoring and control. So in our today's session, we're going to learn about the user interface prototyping. So first we'll see about the user interface requirements. So after that, we'll see what are the characteristics it has. Along with that, I will be discussing regarding UI prototyping. So already you know about the prototyping. If I'm doing that for the user interface, then that is regarding UI prototyping, and also we'll see what software document is all about and what are the types of documentation we have, and then who is this analyst, that is who is the software system analyst, what is its role and responsibility, that I'm going to discuss in my today's session. Let me get into the topic of user interface requirements. Already you know, right, what do you mean by requirement? So requirements are we are going to give several activities which needs to takes place in order to satisfy the requirement of a customer. Then in this user requirement or user interface requirement, if you consider any software system development, this will going to be a very important role. It will going to play a very important role, right? So in this, we are going to accept any of the software based on certain conditions or based on certain parameter. For example, when you visit to any of the shop, why you are going to choose a particular dress or why you are going to choose a particular product? Because it will going to satisfy your requirements. So with the same way, here also we are going to accept certain software or a product or a system based on certain parameter. Then what it must be? So it needs to be easy to operate. If you are selecting any of the software, it must be easy for the operation and to do the operate of that particular software or a product. And also quick in response. For example, if I'm sending a message through WhatsApp, if it is taking 1 day to reach the recipient, are we going to use that software or application? No, right? It must be quick in response, so that when the response time is very less, then you can say that that kind of system or a software is more efficient. So that in the terms of quick in response also we can accept a software, and also effectively handling operational errors. So if something goes wrong and if uncertain errors occurs or unrelated error occurs during the execution of a program, then it must be potential enough to recover from that error. And also providing simple and consistent user interface. Mainly it has to provide the consistent user interface and it should be simple. So by having all these parameters, we are going to take or we are going to accept some of the software. Then what do you mean by this user interface requirements? For example, if I wanted to use any of the system, whether it can be hardware or a software, then we require an interface, that is a medium in order to communicate or to have a conversation with a computer system. So that here we have certain characteristics with respect to the user interface requirements. So when I'm collecting the requirement in order to design user interface, then that must satisfy all these characteristics. What is the first one? That is content presentation. How it will going to present the content, whether it will be in the terms of text, images, table, audio, video, the data type or whatever the data that we are displaying can be of any type. So that content presentation capability should be there in the user interface requirement. And also it needs to be easy navigation. For example, if I have more web pages or if I have more pages to be navigated, or if I wanted to jump from one web page to another web page when I am using any of the application or a software, then it must be easy. So it has to show us, right? For example, if I wanted to go back from this page, then it must be some navigation should be there, and undo, redo, all those options should be there. So navigation should be easy. So in that way we have to design a user interface. And also simple interface. It should not be complex. Users should not get confused what they are using. So that should not happen with a user interface, so that it needs to be simple and responsive. So for example, if you are clicking on any button, it must be responsive, right? And if I am having any mouse over event when I am developing that particular software or a product, then it must be very responsive in nature. And also consistent UI elements. So whatever the UI elements, it can be radio buttons or it can be checkbox, drop down menu, anything it can be, so that whenever we are using, it needs to be consistent. For example, you wanted to apply for the PGCET. So today you are going to try to fill the application. So somehow you couldn't fill that. By tomorrow when you visit the same web page or when you visit the same website again, at that time whatever the content it had should not get changed frequently. So that consistent element should be there when we are having this user interface. And also feedback mechanism. If something goes wrong, I am not liking this application or a software and I wanted to have certain changes, then there must be a mechanism to send the feedback, so that with the help of that review or feedback, they can improve themselves with respect to the user interface. And also it should have some default settings. So if you consider any of the thing in your mobile or laptop, there we are going to have default setting for camera or alarm and all the songs, that means related to display and volume. So certain default settings will be there, right? So that is what standard settings which is given at the time of its production or manufacturing. So that kind of things should also be there in the user interface. So by default they are going to give the date as a system date, and it will going to select the country as India, and that is what some default settings should be there when we are having this user interface requirement. And also purposeful layout. It should not simply contain any of the layout which is not so useful. So there must be a purpose when we are having any of the layout in the user interface. And also strategical use of color and texture. It should be compatible with the eye. So that means color combination should be pleasant. And also provide help information. If you are not able to understand what we have or how to use that, then there must be one box called help information. With the help of this, we can get to know what has to be done. And also user-centric approach. Mainly, for example, if I am teaching something, then I should not teach in my perspective. That means I know the subject, even students should know that. That should not be the thing. So when we are teaching, it must be student-centric. That means based on the perspective of student, we have to teach. In the same way, here also it needs to be user-centric approach. So whatever the interface they are having, that should satisfy the requirement of a customer. It should not be based on, or it should not be the perspective of designer or a developer or any other person. It should be mainly related to the user-centric approach. And also it should have some group-based view setting. So these are the things, these are the characteristics which you can expect in the user interface requirements. So now we'll see what do you mean by user interface prototyping is all about. Now I got to know what is user interface, right? It's a medium which will going to connection, or which will going to build a connection or a link between the customer and the system. Then how we can see the content on the screen, that is what user interface. Then what about this user interface prototyping? Already we got to know regarding the prototyping, right? So in the prototyping, they are going to have some core functionality. Along with that, based on the requirement of a customer or based on the feedback of a customer, they are just going to evaluate, or they are just going to have its evolutionary process of building that prototyping. So here also they are going to take the communication, or they are going to accept the feedback or review from a customer when they are doing the interface. They are going to have certain radio buttons and checkbox. So by making use of certain UI elements, they are going to prepare a UI design. That is what user interface design. So then they will give it to user. When the user starts working through that, if they feel I wanted to change that content, this content, then they will come up with certain feedback. So again, the designer will going to design as per the requirement of a customer. So when they have a communication between the customer as well as to the designer and developer, they are working, or they are manufacturing or developing this user interface. So that user interface or UI prototyping, it's an iterative analysis technique. So why we are saying iterative? Because this is not static. If I wanted to add certain content by the next iteration, then we can do that. That's why it will be considered as what? Iterative analysis technique, in which users are actively involved in the mocking up of the UI for a system. As I told, if it is a prototyping, then there will be a involvement of the customer or a stakeholders when the development of system or a process or a product is being done. So that in the user interface also, user will going to communicate with a designer and a developer, and they will be there when they are developing the user interface for a system. And also user interface will going to have several purpose. So it will be based on the analysis, and it can be related to requirement gathering. So in all the stages, it will going to have its own purpose. Then how this user interface prototyping will going to be helpful in the terms of analysis? So it will going to enable us to explore the problem space with your stakeholders. So when we have a prototyping, when the user has a communication with the development team, at the time of analysis, it will going to help us in order to understand the problem space of your system. That means what is the problem, why we require this, and what is the root cause analysis. Everything will be known when we have this user interface prototyping. Then how this user interface will going to be helpful in the requirement artifact? Mainly, if you don't have a requirement, then there is no invocation of doing a project or a product or a system. So that when the requirements artifact, it will going to do the initially of the envision of a system. Then what about design artifact? This will going to enable us to explore the solution space of your system. So in the analysis, we got to know the problem space. In the design, we got to know the design space, or we will get to know the solution space of the system. So what was the problem? Got analyzed in the analysis artifact. And when we get to know what is the requirement is all about, after that it will be converted into design part. There we have to focus on the solution space. And also mainly it will going to act as a vehicle for the communication between the stakeholders and UI interface of the system. So that for everything, like for the purpose of requirement gathering or requirement artifact and design artifact, and also for the analysis artifact along with the communication artifact, this user interface prototyping will going to help us. Mainly what? There will be a communication between the development team as well as to the stakeholders or a customer. This is regarding user interface prototyping. So next, we'll see about the software document. So now we got to know that we have a requirement that has been gathered and analysis is done, and now it needs to be documented. Already we know about the SRS, that is software requirement specification. In that we have a functional requirement, non-functional requirement. Everything will going to be well documented by the analyst, right? Then What do you mean by software document here? So that software documentation is a written text or illustration that accompanies a computer software or is embedded in the source code. Already you know about the source code. So a code or a programming which has been written by the programmer will be considered as a source code. So in the documentation, we are going to have a source code along with a text, or it will going to have a computer software complete code within it. So we are having that as a document. This will going to helpful, and it will going to mainly explain us how to use the software and how software will going to works. So how to operate it and how it is operating. So that is what will be stored in this software document. If you don't have a software documentation, then we won't able to understand what is happening in the system. And if I wanted to do some changes, if I don't know its theoretical aspect, then there will be some difficulties in order to understand the system in a proper manner. So that documentation will going to help us in order to keep track of what is happening in the system development. So then what are the types of software documentation we have? It can be related to requirement documentation. All the requirements will going to be gathered there, and we have our architectural documents. What are the diagram, designing part, whatever we have, that will going to be stored here. And technical documentation with respect to the source code, but computer can't understand source code, that needs to be converted into object code. All the things will going to be done in the technical. At last we have a end user documentation. It's somehow like a manual. So when you are purchasing any of the electronic devices or anything, whether you are purchasing, at that time you are going to get one user manual, right? Then that will showcase us how to use that product and what this product is all about and how it is going to be operable. So all those content will going to be stored as a document. So these are the types of software documentation we have. After that, so requirement gathering over, and we have specified the requirement, and that analysis has been done, right? And we documented it properly. Then who is this person? Software system analyst. So main thing is what? Now we have a requirement, we have a gathered requirement that needs to be analyzed in the software development phase. Then if you don't know what requirement is all about, if analysis goes wrong, then everything will be waste of doing the product or a project or a development of a software as well. So that we require the analyst. So he is a person, he comes under where we see here system analyst in an IT organization is a person. He is going to analyze the requirement of the proposed system existing, in the sense which is already there. Proposed system in the sense the system which is under the development, or system which you are developing in the future. That is what proposed system. And also ensures that requirements are conceived and documented properly and correctly. What is his main task? He is going to analyze the requirement which is required for the proposed system, and also mainly he will be concentrating regarding conceiving and gathering all the requirements together, and it needs to be documented properly and clearly. Then when is the role of this analyst will going to be started in the SDLC process? We know that, right? We have a feasibility study. After that, requirement collection or gathering of the requirements. Once the requirement is gathered, that needs to be documented. That will going to be the responsibility of this analyst. So after that, he need to do the analysis. So in the phase of analysis, then the job of this analyst will going to takes place. And what is the main usage of having analyst in the software development? He has to make sure that the developed software should meet the requirements of the client or a customer or a stakeholders. So if he does something wrong with the analysis of a requirement of a customer, then we won't be able to satisfy the requirement of a customer as well. So that the analyst, he must be clever enough in order to understand the requirements of a customer. So that analyst must be very responsible person. So now we'll see what are the roles and responsibilities will be done by this analyst. We'll see the first point, that is analyzing and understanding the requirements of the intended software. User will going to give the software, but being an analyst, he must be able and he must be capable of analyzing and understanding all the requirement which is required for the development of a software, and also understanding how the project will contribute in the organization objectives. Simply, everybody will not going to accept your requirements. So, being a team of development team, they have to think about their standards of the organization or an enterprise. So, if they are able to do the project, but if it is not worth for their organization or an enterprise, then they won't accept. So, they have to think about their objectives of the organization. If it is satisfying the requirements of a customer, along with that it is matching the what standards of an organization, then only they are going to accept your requirement. So that you might have seen that kind of scenarios when you are having a project or when you are doing a project, everybody will not going to accept your project title. Why? Because they need to analyze and understand what this project is all about, so that if it is not contributing anything and if it is not worth for the organization or any of the institution, then they won't accept. So when I wanted to reject or accept the projects or any of the development of a software or a product, then they have to think in the terms of organization objective. If it is satisfying the standards of an organization, and even if it is worthy in the terms of money or budget or whatever the time they are spending on that, based on that, they are just going to understand how this project will going to contribute to our organization. So after that, they have to identify the sources of requirement. So from where they are going to get the requirement, who are all the sources, whether they are getting the requirements from the web or a big data, or whether all the requirement is given by the stakeholder itself. By analyzing all those things, they have to understand the source of having the requirement. If they don't have the enough requirement to develop a software, then the user will going to end up with a no satisfaction of that software or a proposed software. So that being a responsible analyst, he must identify the sources of the requirement and also validation of requirement. If the customer is saying something and if they are coming up with 100 numbers of requirement, being analyst, they are not going to accept all the requirement. They are just going to validate and verify all the requirement whether it is required or not. So they are going to have a negotiation with the customer. So if it is validated to accept, then only they will accept the requirement. So that validation of a requirement is also the responsibility of this system analyst. And develop and implement the require management plan. Why? Because so when the requirement which is given by the customer should be maintained and managed throughout the development of a project, as well as even at the time of management. So even if it is deployed to the customer location, that needs to be managed, so that all the development and implementation requirement will going to be stored in the management plan. And also they are going to have one more responsibility with respect to the documentation of the business, technical, process and product requirements. And user at last should not say that, right, I didn't told this requirement but you have incorporated it, and we told that requirement but you didn't incorporate it. So in order to minimize all those difficulties, or in order to remove all those ambiguities, they need to document all the requirements which is related to business or which is related to technical as well as to the process and product requirements. So if we have all the requirements in the terms of documentation, then we can track it easily. So that is what the reason. And coordination with the clients to prioritize the requirements and remove ambiguity. So that here, why they have to remove certain ambiguities or difficulties. So as I told earlier, user may not know everything about the system what they want. So they just come up with certain core functionality. Being an analyst, they must be able to communicate with the user, and they have to negotiate and they have to make the user understand whether this requirement is needed for the system development or not. So that negotiation and communication and coordination with the client or a customer or to the stakeholders is also the responsibility of the analyst. And also finalizing acceptance criteria with client and other stakeholders. As I told, so they won't accept all the requirements. So accepting or rejecting of the requirement which is coming up with the stakeholders will be left to the system analyst. So you have to analyze in all the 360 degree of they have to understand whether it is required or not, whether it is feasible to implement this system or not, will it going to be helpful or in order to contribute certain things with the organization or enterprise. By analyzing and understanding all those perspective, then only they will do the acceptance of the requirement of a customer. So these are the roles and responsibilities which comes under the software system analyst. So if he does the analysis things in a very effective and efficient manner, then remaining phases will going to be very easy. And also he must be capable enough in order to convert the requirement which is given by the customer in a natural language that needs to be converted into technical terms. So then only the designing team and developing team will going to understand what is the requirement of a customer. So that documentation of all those business, technical as well as process and product requirement will be very important. It's all about software system analyst. I hope you all understood. It's all about our today's session. In the coming session, we'll see the last topic, that is regarding analysis modeling. So what are the different types of models we have in order to do the analysis? Along with that, we'll see about the data, behavioral as well as functional models in the software requirement. Let me meet you in the next session. Until that, keep learning, keep on growing. Thank you.